Death and dying is not a subject that is routinely discussed in our society, and consequently the planning for end of life is an often neglected part of the support of people living with dementia. This is further compounded by the fact that dementia is not widely accepted and acknowledged as being a terminal disease in our community. For some of you, today's seminar will be the first steps towards increasing your understanding of the importance of end-of-life planning. For others, it will provide an opportunity to explore these issues in more detail.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to be here with you. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders of all the cultures that make up this wonderful country of Australia, again past and present. I recently managed to find a convict in my family tree. Yay! You realise that's Australian royalty, don't you? And of course I went and looked at why he was convicted, and I had the usual rosy glow myth of, did he steal a loaf of bread to feed the children? Not in our family. He was convicted of bigamy. So what we're going to talk about today is planning for end of life for people with dementia. There are two booklets that, with the help of a committee from Alzheimer's Australia, I prepared, and you either have them today or they are available for download off the website. But not all of the issues covered in those booklets will I be able to address today. But if there's anything I don't, and it's something that you are particularly keen for me to talk about or to answer questions on, please make sure that you let me know that. So the context for what we are about to talk about is that better living conditions and healthcare have led to increased longevity. You may know that in the last census in Australia, we had almost 4,000 people, over 100, many of them still living at home well and happily. I actually thought that was pretty good until about 2 years ago when I was asked to go to Nagoya University in Japan and do a presentation. I thought I'd better have a look at their stats. At the time, they had 36,000 people over 100. Nevertheless, we're doing well. And in addition, rapid technological development has allowed people who would previously have died to be kept alive for long periods of time, often through the use of such things as ventilators and feeding tubes. But these very successes have led to practical, legal and ethical issues, in particular around end of life and extending the dying process, including for the increasing numbers of people with dementia. In a lot of my research, I've become aware of fears and concerns in the general community about end of life. Fears and concerns that often are getting in the way of those people who are still reasonably well, living well now. And they told me stories about loved ones left hooked up to machines until the very end. We couldn't even get close enough to give him a hug and say goodbye. Another woman said Mum always said she wouldn't want to be resuscitated if her heart stopped, but they wouldn't listen. And this last one is very, very concerning. This was a man in his late 80s. He still had capacity, but he'd decided he'd had enough, so he decided he would stop eating and drinking. And his wife said, first of all, he was stubborn when he was in hospital. He was just starving himself. They couldn't get him to eat, so they had to force feed him. They put a tube down his nose, and then they had to tie him in the bed because he kept pulling it out. He just didn't want it. There was no question about his capacity. If he just didn't want it, he just didn't have to have it. That is evidence of assault. If I say to a doctor or a nurse, don't touch me, and they do, even to save my life, I can have them for assault, and I'll come back and explain that to you in a while. When we asked people out in the community, if you were terminally ill, what do you think would cause you the most distress? In every study we did, loss of mental faculties came in first. In every study we did, loss of control came in second. In the first study, we had extreme pain, and it came in at number 3. And then the research team said, why have we got extreme pain on this list? If someone's in extreme pain, they should sue their doctor. So we changed it simply to physical pain. And in the second study, it dropped down to 6th area of concern. In the third study, it dropped down to number 8. because we added more items in and it wasn't what was most concern to people. Every study we did, death itself came in last, no matter how many items we had. People were not afraid of dying. They were afraid of loss of mental faculties, loss of control and independence, being a burden on families, loss of dignity. These things were of much more concern to people than death itself. Actually, every time I see this slide, it reminds me of Woody Allen. You know, Woody Allen said, "I'm not afraid of dying, I just don't want to be there when it happens." I don't want to be there when it happens either. So, after a diagnosis of dementia, it's possible to plan for expected changes. And a diagnosis of dementia for you or someone you care for may cause a range of emotions, including grief, disbelief, anger, shock, or even relief. Sometimes people actually say, "Oh, well, at least now we know what's going on." And knowing the diagnosis at an early stage allows time for setting up good supports and planning for expected changes as the disease progresses. But when I say early stage, I absolutely do not mean some of the suggestions that have been coming around lately that with a simple blood test or a gene test, we may be able to tell you 15 years in advance if you're likely to get dementia. Yeah? Why? Can you do something about it? If you can't, it's unethical to do that test, because someone could test positive and spend 12 of those 15 years absolutely terrified of what's coming and then get hit by a bus or die of something else. Or in that 15 years, a cure might be found. Now, I can say that if something is available, which if you're diagnosed, you can be treated, that makes good common sense. But it's like screening for anything. There is no ethical justification in doing it unless you can actually offer something to people who test positive. So when I'm talking about early diagnosis, I'm talking about when the first symptoms start to appear. Because if you do start planning then, it means the person with dementia can participate in the planning process and ensure that his or her wishes for end-of-life care are known and recorded. So what is advanced care planning? Well, it's a process. It's not just a signature on a piece of paper. And we're very fortunate to have Jill with us today, and we'll hear a lot more about what's available in Victoria. But across Australia, there are mechanisms in every state and territory to allow for advanced care planning. It allows a person to make their wishes known in advance, their decisions about healthcare for a future time when they may not have capacity. And ideally, it involves a discussion between the person, their healthcare providers, and their family or carer or even friends about their values and beliefs and wishes for end-of-life care. But I just will stress that it doesn't have to do that. Someone could simply write down their wishes and they may have a very clear idea of what they want. They may have witnessed less than optimal deaths and they may think, I don't want that, and they may know very clearly what they do and don't want. Ideally, yes, it involves the discussions. If the discussion hasn't taken place, it is still legally binding. For it to be fully effective, of course, it does need to be recorded, because once you've lost capacity, someone needs to have a record of what you want.